Welcome to free audiobooks from Ngân hàng Book Review channel from our Pham. Hope you enjoy all these novels. If you love any books, you can support author by like, share or donate. Thank you.
Sequel of Part 4. Fiction Audiobook, Egypt. Temptation of the Dream Part 5, voiced by AI Ava from Clipchamp. And civilians would have a greater chance of survival. Meanwhile, off the northwestern coast, a large fleet stood ready. Warships, transport vessels, civilian ships, all awaited the order. As soon as the nations agreed, the evacuation would commence immediately. Time was running out. If that statue truly awakened the others, an unimaginable catastrophe would follow, a mass extinction not caused by mankind, but by an ancient force rising from the depths of the pyramid. The Great Pyramid, once a national wonder, had now become a vault for apocalyptic of destruction. No words could truly capture the horror of it. Across the ocean, countries began calling urgent meetings to consider Egypt's plea. After several tense days of deliberation, a consensus was reached. They would accept Egyptian refugees, but under specific conditions. Each region would only accept a fixed number of people, and refugees would be required to pay a higher tax rate than local citizens. The additional tax ranged from 5% to 10%, depending on the country. Given the current crisis, the Egyptian government had little choice. The supreme leader received the final proposal and swiftly approved it, because even at the cost of high taxes, at least the people still had a chance to survive. He immediately ordered his subordinates to spread the news to the public. People would be divided by groups and assigned to different host nations based on their capacity to receive them. Once they arrived, they would be under the full authority of the host country, no longer Egyptian citizens. And so, the fleets of warships, transport vessels, and civilian boats began to cross the ocean, carrying tens of thousands, people leaving behind their past, their homeland, and everything they once called their own just to seek life in a new land. Back on the other side, the divine statue had no idea that the Egyptian population was evacuating in haste, abandoning what could have been a rich harvest of souls for it. It continued silently toward the Khufu pyramid, followed by a floating golden stone platform trailing behind. Without needing rest, it reached the pyramid in just a few short days. Without hesitation, it entered the pyramid's still-lit neon corridors, descending through ancient hallways into the deep chambers below. Near the entrance of the chamber stood another statue, identical to it, unmoving atop a large wheeled platform. The divine statue stepped forward and gently touched its companion. Instantly, the dormant statue began to tremble slightly, fine cracks forming across its black coating. As bits of the outer shell flaked off, a shimmering black and gold skin was revealed underneath. Wasting no time, the divine statue opened the leather pouch at its waist. Reaching inside, it drew out handfuls of souls, tiny white figures trembling in fear, and slowly brought them to the mouth of the awakening statue. The statue began to absorb them, devouring the pitiful souls. However, because these souls were too weak, the resurrection process was painfully slow. But the god statue did not stop. It patiently continued feeding more souls to its companion, as if determined to help it recover its full strength as soon as possible. By the time the final soul was swallowed, the second god statue had finally awakened completely. Yet the souls of those poor humans, mortals without any divine mark, without the gift of God in their being, were not strong enough to awaken the true power slumbering within the statue. The restored power amounted to only about 5 to 7%. A pitiful amount, unworthy of such an ancient divine entity. As soon as its eyes opened, golden light beamed through the cracked pupils, and the statue let out a furious roar. The scream echoed through the chamber like thunder in a crypt. It refused to accept this weakened state. It raised its head and let out a piercing howl as if to declare its demand. More soul. More. Its voice was dry, hoarse, like stone grinding against stone. The original god statue, the one who had awakened it, remained still, silent. It made no response, simply watching its companion rage, like a solemn god silently accompanying the awakening. Back in Egypt, crowds surged and scrambled at the evacuation stations. The people were packed tightly together. Evacuation could not happen overnight. Although no one knew exactly when the disaster would strike, a growing sense of unease loomed over every corner. People hurriedly packed their belongings, clutching their children, guiding their elderly parents, waiting hopelessly. They still believed that if they could leave this land before the god statues returned, they would have a chance to survive. However, while the civilians were still jostling through the chaotic crowds, the highest-ranking leaders of Egypt, along with their families, had already departed quietly on the very first ships and planes. They left behind their lower-ranking subordinates to continue managing the evacuation. Naturally, the families of these subordinates had already secured safe spots on the list. They were the last tier to remain tasked with maintaining order. But crossing the ocean wasn't easy. They couldn't simply fly there in an hour or glide across the waves in time. The ships were running at full capacity, planes taking off day and night, transporting group after group away from Egypt, away from the ancient disaster now awakening. Deep within the underground chambers of the Giza pyramid, two dog-headed statues of Anubis, the gods who ruled the realm of the dead, stepped out of the shadows. Their heavy heels slammed onto the stone floor, creating echoes that sounded like the warning tolls of an impending apocalypse. The golden stone platform hovered behind them, following every step. They said nothing. Their eyes, black as cosmic voids, scanned the horizon. And then, as if sensing something, both turned their heads simultaneously to the northwest, where a concentration of soul energy was gathering, more and closer than anywhere else. Without hesitation, the two began to march. Every step sent tremors through the ground. The second god statue, the one just awakened, also summoned back its weapon. A long crescent-shaped sphere, pitch black with a faint golden glow, identical to the first statues. However, it was well aware that its current strength was only at 7%. It would continue hunting souls, and it would rise to its former glory once more. Chapter 19. High above in the sky, a surveillance plane circled. Through its lens, the image of two colossal Anubis statues slowly moving came into clear view. They were in no hurry. Judging by the direction they were heading, the observation team immediately understood. Their destination was the most densely populated area, where millions of people were still waiting to be evacuated. The information was relayed instantly, triggering an emergency alert. On the receiving end, the remaining lower-ranking officials left behind to maintain order got the message. Their faces turned pale, grim. No one had expected the disaster to come this quickly. Without hesitation, they issued a red alert. Sirens wailed through the air. Red warning lights flashed on buildings and evacuation stations. When the people heard the signal, they all knew what it meant. Danger was near. Very near. But the transport ships hadn't returned. The battleships offshore were still far away. There was no time to wait. Staying meant dying. Everyone understood that. Chaos exploded everywhere. Crowds pushed, screamed, shoved. The lower-ranking officials, who had once tried to calm the public, were now panicking themselves, unable to maintain any semblance of order. Instead, they were the first to run, jumping into cars, speeding off toward the nearest neighboring countries. Seeing this, the people immediately fled after them. No one was foolish enough to stay behind waiting for evacuation boats. There was no more trust. No more hope. Escaping was the only choice. Millions of people flooded out of the evacuation stations. They abandoned luggage, blankets, even valuables. Some ran back home to get their cars. Walking was too slow. But not everyone dared. Their homes were too close to the pyramids. So close that if they encountered the statues, they'd be the first to die. Still, whether they had cars or not, whether they were rich or poor, they had only one option: leave. At all costs. Flee the evacuation zones, escape the land teetering on the edge of death. Run as far as they could. Near Egypt's borders, the closest neighboring countries had erected enormous walls, towering barriers that seemed built to resist even the gods. Steel, concrete, every resource had been mobilized in record time. But due to the urgency, the walls were still unfinished. Their inner core was thin, not yet strong enough to withstand a single blow from the supernatural force approaching. The construction sites remained in disarray. Machinery roared day and night. Workers did not sleep. They all knew, if the wall wasn't finished in time, it would be nothing more than a joke against the might of ancient gods. If they even were gods, perhaps just demons in divine disguise. A bit farther away, countries not sharing borders with Egypt were also racing against time. They hastily erected high defensive walls. Every meter of borderland became an emergency construction site. And farther still, distant nations, they had the advantage of distance. Geography became a rare blessing granted by nature in this chaotic age. They had more time to build truly fortified defenses. In just 2 short days, the evacuation stations had become deserted wastelands. The people, millions of them, had fled, scattered like ants from a destroyed nest. But that very chaos was what drew the attention of the 2 divine statues. They stood still in the desert, eyes hollow yet seemingly able to see through every soul running for their lives. They could clearly sense it, streams of living energy scattering, moving. Some of those life forces were very close, extremely close. They're running. That thought flickered like a whisper between the 2 statues. And then, without warning, both suddenly accelerated. Their once heavy strides transformed into thunderous leaps. The desert trembled, sand billowed violently behind every lightning-fast stride. They charged toward the evacuation station. On the way, they spotted dozens of civilians heading back, a fatal mistake. They only wanted to retrieve their cars. But no one realized that this decision would seal their fate. When the 2 statues appeared, those civilians froze for a moment, then their faces turned ghostly pale as they screamed and turned to flee. But it was already too late. The 2 statues said nothing. They only gave a chilling smile. From their open mouths, 2 black fangs appeared, as dark as volcanic rock and as sharp as daggers. The first statue reached out, a gentle touch. Instantly, the man's soul was yanked out of his body like a stream of white smoke. His body collapsed without a sound. The second statue, without hesitation, pulled the soul from a woman and devoured it on the spot, like a ravenous beast swallowing its prey whole. In the blink of an eye, the road turned into hell. Civilians lay sprawled everywhere. Their eyes were lifeless, mouths frozen open as if they were about to scream one last time, but no breath came out. No one had time to resist. No one had time to cry for help. Only an ancient grim reaper reaped souls with cold, ruthless precision. Anyone with a soul, even the faintest flicker, could not escape those deep black eyes, like bottomless pits. No stone wall, no shelter, no camouflage could hide them. They did not see with their eyes, but with the ancient instinct of soul-eating beings. Even if people hid underground, in dark bunkers, or disguised themselves as corpses among the rubble, they would still be found. The statues could still hear the faint resonance of a soul. A single glance was enough for them to trace it. And once detected, running was pointless. Prayers were meaningless. Could human legs ever outrun divine statues? Right after that small harvest, the first statue handed the handful of collected souls to the second. Without a word, Without a single wasted gesture, the second statue absorbed them immediately. Then both turned and ran, headed toward the evacuation zone. There could be no delay. Delay meant lost many souls. They needed no rest, knew no fatigue, effortlessly crossing burning sands, jagged rocks, and abandoned cities. In the far distance, hundreds of kilometers away from the evacuation zone, a massive crowd of people was fleeing in despair like a scattered colony of ants. Those with vehicles drove at full speed. Those without ran, walking step by step along dusty roads. The young supported the old. Parents dragged their children along. Each bottle of water, each salvaged biscuit found along the road became a fight for survival, snatched and fought over. No one cared about anyone else. There was no order, no lines. Only raw instinct for survival. And no matter how hard they tried, the distance to the border still stretched endlessly ahead. After 1 or 2 days of evacuation, those with motorized vehicles had pulled far ahead. Many had traveled nearly 1,000 kilometers. A flicker of hope began to rise. They could see light at the end of the tunnel. But they didn't dare stop, because something terrifying was chasing from behind. Meanwhile, the on-foot group moved much slower. They had only covered a few hundred kilometers. Though they tried to make use of every moment, every drop of water, every breath, the border ahead still felt like a far-off dream. Too far for human endurance. Yet on that path of escape, hope still flickered. They found abandoned vehicles, out of fuel, slightly damaged, or simply left behind in panic. Those still strong enough joined forces to repair them, racing against time to claim speed. Many groups were fortunate like that, quickly jumping into vehicles to catch up with those ahead who already had transportation. In another direction, south of the evacuation zone, was another massive crowd pouring. They didn't know what was chasing them from behind. They only knew one thing. Staying meant death. Running might mean survival. At that moment, at the evacuation station, now abandoned and deserted, the 2 jackal-headed statues appeared. They stood in the middle of a vast open field, where the wind swept up dust under the blazing sun. Both scanned their surroundings. There was no one left. But the aura of souls still lingered, floating faintly in the air. They closed their eyes, sensing deeply, then opened them simultaneously. One direction, south. Another, west. The soul energy was thick, overwhelming. No exchange was needed. The 2 split up instinctively. One sprinted south. The other darted west. Their speed surged. Their feet smashed the ground beneath, leaving deep impressions like the footprints of death itself. No soul would escape. All would end up inside them. No matter how fast the 2 statues were, it still took them a full day before they caught sight of the people, a vast sea of refugees sleeping sprawled across the open land. They were utterly exhausted after days of fleeing. They thought they were safe, at least for now. Then came the sound, like thunder rumbling from afar, growing louder by the second. The ground trembled. The sand lifted in waves. The guards heard the dreadful noise. They screamed the alarm. They shouted. They ran. Some scooped up their children and fled in panic. Others jumped into vehicles and sped off in despair. The rest, those who were sleeping, jerked awake. No time to grab anything. No time to look back. No time to think. They ran like mad, desperate to survive. Leaving behind aging parents, leaving behind confused children still groggy from sleep. All to preserve their own lives. In both directions, south and west, the exact same scene unfolded. The same catastrophe. The statues had caught up with the groups on foot. And the vehicle convoys? Still far, far ahead. The 2 statues charged into the crowd like ravenous beasts. A single touch, and a soul was torn away. One person didn't even have time to scream. Another collapsed instantly, lifeless. Human strength. How could it ever outrun the footsteps of a god? Horse-drawn carts and mule wagons stood motionless by the roadside amid the chaos. The animals, those beasts, just stood there, eyes blank and dazed. They witnessed humans fall one by one to the yellow soil, to the stone-paved roads. Some stared wide-eyed, not even comprehending what had happened. Others already had whites for eyes, their souls drained by a mere touch. The two god statues strode past the wagons, past the draft animals, without sparing them a glance. They didn't care, didn't bother, because animals had no souls. And without a soul, they weren't worthy of these demons' attention. After gathering a massive number of souls, the two statues stood again in the open field. They turned their heads, abyssal black eyes gazing toward the retreating convoy. Cars, horse carts, mule wagons, even bicycles, all fleeing in utter desperation, leaving behind clouds of golden dust. The distance was now great, several hundred meters, with some already miles ahead. But to the feet of gods, that meant nothing. The two statues began running. Fast. Like nightmares carved from black stone. People in the vehicles turned back, and they saw them coming. Screams erupted everywhere. "Please spare me. I don't want to die. Please don't come." They whipped their horses, yanked reins, pedaled until their legs almost snapped. But the speed of beasts, or humans, how could it compare to divine beings? A panicked horse cart crashed headlong into a giant tree, shattering after a single touch. A mule cart smashed into a storefront, accompanied by screams and a cloud of dust, the mule's corpse now draped in the limp body of its soulless driver. A man, driving a horse-drawn cart, turned his head and shouted at the statue running after him. "Stay away from me." But beside him, less than a meter away, the statue was running alongside him, silently. Then, with a single touch, the man's soul was swiftly ripped out, his eyes glazed over and then went dim. The horse-drawn cart lost control and crashed straight into a roadside building. His body was also thrown from the cart. Chapter 20. The cars, with their superior speed, had temporarily escaped the chase. They pressed the gas pedal continuously, distancing themselves from the statues, carrying with them a hope for survival. But after collecting the souls of those in the rudimentary vehicles, the two statues did not stop. They turned, their deep black eyes focused ahead, where the lingering scent of souls was still scattered in the wind. Without hesitation, they continued to charge forward. The people in the cars, thinking they were safe, sighed with relief. Until some turned their heads and looked out of the rear windows and saw dust swirling up, rushing toward them like a storm. A scream erupted in the car. "They're chasing us. Speed up. Speed up quickly." The driver immediately floored the gas pedal. But the price to pay was the fuel gauge dropping rapidly to a terrifying level. They hadn't had a chance to refill, and panic made everyone press the accelerator, trying to flee. The fuel gauge inched inch by inch. It was nearing the red zone. Inside the car, there was a deadly silence. Sweat beaded, hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Some people closed their eyes, murmuring prayers. "Please, my gods, please save us." But no gods came. No miracle happened. Even if the gods heard them, there was no way they could save them in time. How could distant water put out the nearby fire? All that was coming was the dust, surging toward them. And behind that was death, in the shape of black and yellow. The moment the fuel gauge hit the red zone was the moment fate was sealed. Death was right behind them. Some cars were luckier. They had brought reserve fuel containers. The moment the fuel gauge touched the red line, without hesitation, they had someone climb out while the car slowed down, refueling while shouting instructions. Other cars took a simpler route. The gasoline was stored in small water bottles scattered on the floor or in the trunk. They hurriedly opened the tank cap and poured in the fuel bit by bit, hands trembling, trying not to spill a single drop. The smell of gasoline filled the air. The sound of frantic heartbeats, mixed with the howling wind, The dust stormed behind them like the drumbeat of death. As long as they had fuel, they could keep going. As long as the cars kept moving, they had a chance to escape. Even if it was just a faint sliver of hope in this nightmare, they clung to it. No one wanted to die. No one was willing to let their soul be drained on this sun-scorched, dusty road. After hours of being chased, the group with only a small amount of fuel began to face real danger. One by one, the last fuel bottles ran dry. Then the moment everyone feared finally came. The trembling fuel gauge touched the red line. The engines still sputtered. The car coasted a bit on momentum, then slowly came to a stop amid the swirling dust. That moment was like a death knell. Without needing to be told, everyone flung their doors open and leapt out, running with their own 2 feet in one final desperate sprint. Children abandoned, parents left behind, couples torn apart. Only one raw instinct remained: to save their own lives. They knew that if they didn't run, they would die. But they also knew that running on foot, they wouldn't get far. And then, just as expected, their souls were pulled out one by one, each collapsing to the ground with eyes wide open in despair. The wind blew over the hollow bodies, as if mocking the tragedy of humankind. The statue did not stop. It felt no pity. It continued charging forward, toward the distance, where other cars were still running. No matter how far the souls ahead were, they would not escape the hand of death. The cars further ahead had gone a long distance. They began to dare imagine survival, to escape the clutches of death brought by that evil statue. To them, it wasn't a divine messenger, but a demonic god. There was no longer any sign of the statue pursuing them. No more swirling clouds of dust behind. Only a long, open road and the blazing sunlight ahead. They breathed a sigh of relief. The statue had been left behind. Because it took time to collect souls, it had fallen behind. But had they really escaped? That answer they dared not think about. In this brief moment, they seized the precious chance. Check abandoned cars by the roadside, siphoning every last drop of gasoline, pouring it into reserve containers. Whether it was an empty water bottle, a dirty plastic can, or anything that could hold fuel, they used it all. The roadside villages were deserted, but still had food. Cows, donkeys, horses still wandered the fields, ignored by all. Donkey carts and horse wagons lined the roadside, far too slow, too useless for them now. People now believed only in speed. On rooftops, beside doors, on the backs of the cars, everywhere, fuel containers were strapped. Their metal machines had become gas-guzzling beasts. They ate and drank hastily, stuffing energy into their exhausted bodies. Then, once more, they hit the road, heading for the border. Hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes avoiding the rearview mirror. Behind them, the second statue, having gathered enough souls, finally stopped. It climbed back onto its golden pedestal and stood still, silently turning back to stone, beginning the process of digesting the souls and restoring its strength. Only the first statue continued the chase, unceasing, relentless. It was death that knew no fatigue, and it had not given up. As the lucky survivors stopped to search for supplies and refuel for their evacuation journey, they were forced to sacrifice something incredibly precious: time. They didn't know that, with every passing second, the statue of Anubis was still chasing them, relentless, never sleeping, never needing food. All they knew was that they needed food, needed fuel, needed a little more hope to keep going. No matter how fast they tried to be, they couldn't escape the harsh reality pulling them back. Those fleeting moments were what would ultimately decide life or death. At the same time, in farther regions, the group that had departed earlier, mostly low-ranking officials, soldiers, and the lucky few who owned vehicles, had already traveled thousands of kilometers. Now, only a few hundred kilometers remained until they reached the border. Just a few hundred more to reach paradise. In their minds, a vision of peace was starting to take shape, A return to a safe life with guarded walls, soldiers on patrol, light, food, and sleep free from nightmares. It was a shared belief among them all. And yet, no one knew if that terrifying statue could break through the defenses at the border. No one knew if those steel and brick walls could stop a demonic god from ancient Egypt. But they wanted to believe. Because once hope is lost, people will collapse before the statue even arrives. They didn't know the truth. They only hoped that, at that place would be the last safe haven, where they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Half a day after the villagers had left, the jackal-headed statue arrived. It didn't stop. Just swept past the village, not even glancing at the remnants left behind. What it wanted was souls. And it was still chasing. The survivors, who thought they had widened the distance and left the monster far behind, didn't realize. Every time they stopped to eat, every time they took a bathroom break, every moment of rest was a moment the statue closed the gap. By evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky a weary, pale red, everyone saw it. A massive column of dust and smoke, churning like a cyclone on the distant horizon. No vehicle could create such force. No group of people could stir up so much dust. Only one thing could. The demon. A scream rang out. "It's coming! Run!" People leapt into their vehicles, slammed the gas pedal down, and sped off at full throttle. No one looked back. No one cared who was left behind. Those who were too slow were abandoned. They tried to run after the vehicles, screaming for help, tears mixing with dust. But human legs could never outrun wheels moving at full speed. They ran in desperation until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some crawled, others knelt on the scorching ground, breaths ragged, hearts pounding. Only the instinct to survive drove them to move. Even just one more step, some lifted their heads and stared at the towering cloud of dust. Their eyes held no more hope. And when the final rays of sunlight vanished at the horizon, night fell like a giant black curtain. Moonlight quietly bathed the earth, casting a cold, pale glow. Within that dim light, the shadowy figure appeared once more. Every step it took struck the ground with a thud, heavy like hammers pounding into people's hearts. It had arrived. It saw the remaining survivors. They were no longer running, no longer screaming. They only sat or lay there, bodies drained, eyes vacant, having given up everything. No one could cry out anymore. No one could beg. They were exhausted, body and soul. And the monster was no longer in a hurry. It approached each person slowly, as if taking a stroll through a familiar garden. It knew no one could escape anymore. No need to chase. It only needed to reach out and pluck their souls like ripe fruit. Faint glimmers of light floated from human bodies, merged with the darkness, faded like mist, and flowed straight into the pouch hanging at its waist. Once finished, it raised its head to look into the distance. The vehicles had long vanished into the night. Suddenly, the statue let out a roar. Then, like a raging storm, it dashed away, leaving behind a silent land of death, where only soulless bodies lay scattered under the eerie pale moonlight. Chapter 21. In the quiet darkness of night, with the moon high above and the sky completely shrouded in darkness, the group of low-ranking officials and civilians, those fortunate enough to have fled early, had finally arrived. Before them stood a towering border wall, like the last stronghold between life and death. From the watchtowers, surveillance cameras detected movement. An alert was sent out. Defense units were urgently informed. But this time, there were no gunshots. No shouts from the guards. Instead, they were willing to accept the desperate refugees. Rope ladders were lowered from the towering walls. Above, hovering aircraft slowly descended to pick up the exhausted. They crowded up the ladders. Some clutched their children tightly, collapsing with relief, feeling as though they had escaped a nightmare. The aircraft took off, carrying them deep into the safe zone, or at least that's what they believed. Far to the south, in an abandoned, vast field, the second jackal-headed statue, the one that had slumbered for so long, was now fully awakened. It raised its head high, empty eyes blazing like an invisible fire. It scanned the skies, sensing the faint soul energy lingering in the night air. There was a powerful source of souls to the east, but it was far away. It didn't care. Instead, it turned its head southward, where there were more souls and closer. It began to move. With each step, the earth seemed to tremble. A new hunt had begun. After abandoning those who couldn't keep up, the surviving group had learned a painful lesson. They ate on the move, took turns resting, and handled all personal needs within the cramped space of the vehicles. No more feasting or drinking their fill. They adopted a minimalist survival strategy, eating and drinking less to limit bodily needs, focusing all their energy on escape. But vehicles still needed fuel, and gasoline wouldn't fall from the sky. Each time they stopped to gather fuel, the distance between them and the statue shortened. After many days of fleeing, the group finally reached the border, where the towering barricade was constantly being reinforced day and night. On the other side, the neighboring country wasn't idle either. They reinforced the wall, added thicker layers of concrete, hoping that the statue's weapons couldn't destroy this final defense. One by one, the migrants climbed the rope ladders hanging from the tall wall. The process dragged on for hours, and by the time dawn broke, the first Anubis statue had drawn near. From afar, the guards saw a massive dust storm swirling. They immediately shouted out warnings. "Move faster. Climb faster if you don't want to die." At the foot of the wall, many still hadn't managed to climb. Cries and pleas echoed, people begging those above to hurry. But the ladder couldn't be climbed any faster. Some aircraft descended, their doors opening to take in more people. Civilians rushed in, cramming the cabins full, and the planes began lifting off amidst the chaos. But just then, the god statue arrived. It looked up at the sky, seeing aircraft after aircraft rising, carrying away souls that were slipping from its grasp. It remembered the last time, how those same aircraft had dropped bombs on it, insulting it as if flinging filth into its face. In a fury, it charged forward, leaping into the air and slashing a spear at one of the ascending aircraft. The screech of tearing metal rang out sharply. The plane lost control, slammed into the wall, and burst into flames. Many people were thrown out from the plane. Some people lost consciousness, while others had their souls ripped out while still suspended in the air. Those climbing the rope ladder below shuddered, everyone desperately trying to climb faster, despite their hands being scraped and bleeding. The god statue ignored those lying unconscious. It rushed to the base of the wall and violently yanked the rope ladder.
The rope snapped. People fell.
Screams tore through the sky as people dropped from dozens of meters above. Bones cracked, blood splattered, and the chilling sound of impact echoed everywhere. The statue rampaged like a mad beast, ripping down rope ladders one after another, not allowing anyone to escape. Even though the ladders were made of ultra-durable cables, they couldn't withstand the divine creature's forceful tugs. Those who had climbed up earlier crawled pale-faced atop the wall, looking down at the horrifying scene below. They lay flat on the stone surface, trembling like children who had just escaped death. The border guards did not stand by idly. Immediately, they launched artillery shells, aiming directly at the statue.
Boom, boom, boom.
Deafening explosions rang out. But the statue remained unfazed. It swung its side-bladed spear, slicing the artillery shells in half like a warrior cutting down incoming arrows. Some shells were deflected and exploded on the ground, causing the earth and the wall to quake. It was a desperate attack, but it was all humanity could do at that moment. Hay kept firing artillery at the statue, but it looked as if it were dancing amid a storm of bombs and bullets. Spinning, It sliced through multiple shells midair with its sharp crescent blade. Some exploded, blasting it backward, but its body remained unscathed. Not a scratch. It kept dancing in the barrage as if playing on the battlefield, mocking the futile efforts of the tiny insects. Each step it took crushed someone beneath, and their soul was instantly drained. It absorbed living souls even as it deflected shells. Each slash, each swing, was a perfect blend of combat and soul harvesting. Those who witnessed it were paralyzed in silence. No one knew what else to do. The artillery felt meaningless. The horror had reached its peak. When no more shells flew toward it, and all nearby weak souls had been absorbed, the statue stood silently before the towering wall. It could sense that behind this thick wall, just a few meters of cold stone away, lay thousands, millions of souls. Its instincts urged it on. Its hunger surged. It roared, clenched its fists, and slammed a powerful punch into the wall. The wall trembled slightly. It punched again, and again. Each blow thundered like a strike from the heavens, echoing across the borderlands. Then it changed tactics, drawing its scythe spear. It slashed downward with full force, as if trying to split a mountain in half. Sparks flew. A shrill screech rang out from the impact, but the wall stood firm. Not even a single crack appeared. It had used all its strength. For days on end, the statue did not leave the wall. It paced along the fortress like a caged predator, constantly slamming its furious fists into each section, attempting to break through, again and again. Each blow echoed like thunder, each slash filled with rage, yet the wall remained as solid as bedrock, not a single fracture. The soldiers and survivors watching from above sighed in relief. From the high vantage point where guards and cameras kept watch, the soldiers' attitudes gradually changed. Fear turned into mockery. They filmed mocking videos, blasted loudspeakers with laughter, even threw feces and poured urine on the statue in acts of provocation. To them, what was once a nightmare was now nothing more than a wild beast trapped outside an iron cage. But the statue did not give up. It stood still, staring at the wall, keenly aware of the thousands of surviving souls just beyond it, so close, yet so far out of reach. It couldn't touch them, couldn't harvest even a single soul. It raised its head toward the sky and let out a chilling roar, a sound so powerful it seemed to tear the very fabric of the air, shaking the ground beneath. That roar pierced through every fiber of flesh, drilling into every ear. Those who heard the voice, whether soldiers or civilians, felt their limbs go weak. Many couldn't withstand the pressure and collapsed onto the walls, faces pale as corpses. After days of failing to break through the wall, the divine statue finally stopped. No longer enraged, no longer striking or destroying, it stood silently before the wall as if lost in thought. Then, without anyone understanding why, it turned its head and left, slowly walking toward the horizon, as if offering a final farewell. Soon after, its figure gradually faded into the sunset. It had sensed, far to the east, beyond Egypt's borders, a powerful energy source, countless souls living in the densely populated lands of the east. A new place, a new hunt awaited. On the city wall, the soldiers watched its silhouette fade, anxiety stirring in their hearts. Did it really leave? Or is this just a trap? No one could answer. Doubt still lingered, even though the divine statue's figure had vanished from sight. Even so, life went on. The survivors began a phase of reconstruction. They registered new identities, now recognized as citizens under the post-catastrophe government. Life gradually returned to order. No more explosions, no more panic screams, no more frantic fleeing or hopeless weeping. People began to learn how to live again from zero, clinging to the fragile hope that the nightmare would never return. All of Egypt was now nothing more than an empty shell. No human voices, no breath of life. The once bustling avenues were now blanketed in dust and fallen leaves. The great cities, the towering buildings, the once crowded marketplaces, had become nothing but desolate silhouettes, standing silently under the ceaseless winds of the desert. Small villages deep in the interior, where once children played and elders told stories, now fell completely silent. Only creaking wooden doors swayed in the wind, curtains fluttering with no one left to draw them. Livestock, creatures that had no idea what had happened, wandered aimlessly. Goats, cows, sheep roamed deserted streets, grazing on wild grass growing from cracked sidewalks. Some stood at the doorsteps of their old homes, as if waiting for someone to return. At times, in the stillness of night, the lonely cry of an animal echoed, a sound of desperation, calling out in a world that no longer existed. Egypt, once a glorious nation with a millennia-long history, was now nothing more than a forgotten land, a silent witness to an unprecedented catastrophe in human history. From orbit, satellites circled and tracked every movement of the two divine statues. On the control screens, the red dots representing the statues moved slowly, yet purposefully, with clear targets, clear directions. To the south, the second statue had nearly reached the border, but like the first, it was stopped by an impenetrable wall. No matter how hard it struck, how fiercely it tore, the outcome remained unchanged: failure. With no other option, it too had to turn back and seek another path, just as the northern statue had done. As though pulled by an invisible force, as if responding to a silent command echoing in their souls, both statues chose the same direction, east, toward Asia. They traversed the barren lands that had once been a vibrant Egypt. But upon reaching the eastern border, once again, they were met with towering walls. They stopped, punched,
Slashed.
screamed, but the walls stood firm, unmoved. It was as if a colossal invisible cage had sealed the land of Egypt. A catastrophe that once threatened to engulf the entire world was now imprisoned within a dead zone. The rest of the world, though not yet completely safe, could at least breathe a temporary sigh of relief. After months of wandering through Egyptian territory, the two Anubis statues finally came to a halt. They had tried everything, breaking through walls, seeking alternate paths, but there was no way out. The thick walls formed a giant prison that sealed them in. No more souls to absorb, no more targets. It seemed their mission had ended, or perhaps the world itself had rejected them once and for all. On a windless afternoon, amidst the sun-scorched dunes of the desert, both statues quietly climbed the golden stone platform, the place that had once marked the beginning of an unprecedented catastrophe. And then they turned back to stone, standing tall and motionless, as though no disaster had ever taken place. The desert wind blew across their massive bodies, covering their golden-black forms in a layer of dust, the dust of time. The satellites continued to monitor silently, each image transmitted back to the central command. No more movement, no more destructive force. The entire world exhaled in relief, as if having just stepped past the edge of annihilation. They've stopped. The message echoed across global news broadcasts. But no one could be certain. Was this truly the end, or merely the silence before the next storm? Elsewhere, across Europe, in a France that had only recently regained its fragile peace, an investigation was reopened. After everything, someone had ignited this catastrophe. The name of that person appeared in classified files.
Jean.
Jean, a young man burdened by poverty. Government agencies began retracing his steps, digging through records, searching for his family. But everything was murky. When investigators arrived at the apartment Jean had rented, all they found was a filthy attic, smeared with cockroach droppings and reeking of rats. No one knew where he had gone. No messages. No leads. No signs of life since the moment the Anubis statue had awakened. Gene had vanished, as if he had never existed. Chapter 22. Next chapter, the next move of the demonic statues. After 2 years of silence, after a long period of monitoring the two divine statues via satellite, all nations had come to believe that both had completely reverted to lifeless stone. Even so, the global state of alert was never fully lifted. No one dared set foot in the land of Egypt, a true forbidden zone. People feared, what if? Egypt had now become a dead land. Roads covered in dust, villages abandoned and devoid of life. Livestock had become the new masters of the land, roaming freely, grazing on wild overgrowth. Houses stood empty, cities fell silent, grass growing waist-high along the crumbling walls. 2 years after the catastrophic event, the world slowly recovered. Families who had once evacuated found new homes, the economy rebounded, and life returned to its regular rhythm. The disaster seemed to have closed its chapter, like a nightmare gradually fading from memory. But it was at that exact moment the two statues began to awaken once more. Thick layers of dust that had settled on their petrified bodies fell off as they subtly shifted. No loud noise, just a faint movement, but one that signaled the beginning of another nightmare. Their eyes opened. No words were needed. The two gods seemed to understand one another instinctively. One turned its head westward. The other faced east. Then they separated, each heading in a different direction. High above, the satellites continued their rotations. But humans had grown too accustomed to the statue's immobility, so much so that no one paid attention anymore. Until they discovered the statues had completely vanished. Panic broke out as they scrambled to track them. Once the figures were spotted, one heading west, the other east, the alert was sent immediately. The world was shaken. High-level emergency signals were transmitted instantly. Command centers lit up through the night. Nations lying in the two directions the statues were heading, east and west, received the first reports. Top government leaders stood frozen as they read the updates. They had left their positions? It can't be after all these years. Everyone had believed that the past incident was over. But it wasn't. They had returned, and no one knew what they would do next. All people could do was wait and watch. A terrifying truth revealed. They waited. The entire world held its breath, monitoring every signal from the satellites, every small movement. Nearly a week passed before the figures of the two statues reappeared at the edge of high walls. An alarm blared. The demon god Anubis had arrived. In observation centers, all eyes were fixed on the satellite feed. Silence fell. No one spoke. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what the statue would do next. And then they froze. Anubis was kneeling down, using his enormous hands to dig. Massive chunks of earth were being torn away, revealing a deepening pit. Statue was digging a tunnel. At the border observation station, a captain gasped, unable to hide the panic in his voice. It's digging a tunnel. It wants to burrow beneath the wall and reach us through an underground path. Damn it. He immediately sent out an emergency alert. The information was relayed to the high-level command center. Within minutes, the top leaders received the report. A heavy silence fell over the meeting room. Then someone abruptly stood up and slammed their hand on the table. We only built the wall with foundations less than 4 meters deep. If it digs deeper and tunnels underneath, then nothing will be able to stop it. A national-level red alert was issued. A massive evacuation began. Long convoys of vehicles stretched out of the danger zone. People were in a panic, hurriedly packing their belongings, children crying amid the blaring sirens of military vehicles. No one knew exactly when Anubis would finish digging. It could be a few days, or just a single afternoon. Satellite images continued to stream in. The cameras clearly captured every moment. The demonic statue silently digging, massive chunks of earth being unearthed, every passing minute feeling like a countdown to a nightmare becoming reality. Allied nations received the same data, and at that moment, every expression darkened. On the faces of heads of state, generals, and experts, there was no trace of composure left. Their faces turned grim, their eyes hollow, as though they had just seen the death sentence looming over their own people. If it gets through the wall, what route is left for us to escape? No one could answer that question. This was a landmass stretching from the Middle East to all of Asia, a vast continent, tightly packed with nations, no ocean to divide, no safe distance to retreat to. If the demonic god truly emerged and began its journey, it would sweep through dozens of countries like a black tsunami. Then they looked at the map. The red danger zones were spreading, nation by nation. All neighboring regions were now in the line of danger. But worse than that, there was nowhere left that could absorb such a massive wave of evacuees. The coastal zones were too small. The islands didn't have enough food. The countries across the oceans were too far to reach in time. A quiet sense of helplessness settled over everyone. They had technology. They had weapons. But what they were now facing was beyond imagination. Now, the leaders of every nation understood one thing. There was no way to stop it. No matter how high they built the walls, so what? It could dig. It could tunnel through the earth. And humans, no matter how advanced, could never build a wall that reached the center of the earth. A cruel truth had to be accepted. Now, the only option left was evacuation. No more time. No more chances. Only selection. Only choosing the best, the most essential people for the survival of humanity. And leaving the rest behind. A cold-blooded decision. A painful cut that every nation was forced to make. Because this continent, from Egypt stretching across the entire Middle East and Asia, was too vast. While the continents across the ocean were too small, they could not hold billions of people. Even if they could not feed them. Food, water, shelter, resources, all were limited. The world now stood at the brink of a continental-scale purge. A catastrophe not global, yet devastating enough to wound humanity to its very core. And the people left behind, what would become of them? No one dared to imagine. A summit like no other in human history. Leaders of all the nations on the same continent quickly established an emergency communication line, connecting through the still-functioning satellite networks. There was no arguing, no blaming. Only one question was asked. How many people can the coastal nations take in? And when the final numbers were presented, clear, emotionless like military budgets, silence fell upon all. Soon after, the brutal filtering began. Artificial intelligence systems were deployed to sort every individual. Education, skills, health, reproductive potential, contribution value. The most elite were chosen to survive. The vast majority were left behind. No tears. No farewells. Only cold lists and the sound of submarine gates closing behind them. Even nations deep within the continent, far from the path of the demonic statue, chose the same course of action. They knew sooner or later, their time would come. No one could resist that entity. No weapon, no army, no wall could stand. Only escape. Thankfully, there were still countries, those survival oases along the ocean's edge that were willing to open the final doors. A faint glimmer of hope, like a flickering flame at the end of a tunnel. But the price to be paid was too great. So many bloodlines, so many family names would be erased from history. No trumpets, no memorials, no gravestones. A silent extinction, bloodless yet soaked in tears. The end. The story ends here, for the author only dreamed of the moment when the statue of Anubis began its rampage, harvesting the souls of every person on the continent. In that dream, there was no silhouette from across the ocean. Author's commentary. For end of the novel. As the author of the story, I fully understand and agree with the decisions made by the leaders of the nations on the same continent. In such a situation, this was no longer a matter of morality, but a practical problem of survival. This continent was simply too vast, its population too large. Meanwhile, the landmasses across the ocean could not possibly take everyone in. Not enough space. Not enough resources. Not enough time. If they tried to save everyone, it might have meant the death of all humanity. The selection was cruel, but in the tragedy of an apocalypse, sometimes cruelty is the only way to preserve hope for the future. The selection was cruel, but in the tragedy of an apocalypse, sometimes cruelty is the only way to preserve hope for the future. That said, I still believe that among the billions of ordinary people, there would be those who refuse to lie down and wait for extinction. Perhaps, if they were united and clear-headed enough, they would come up with another path, build ships, set sail, and make the ocean their place of survival. No longer living on the continent ruled by a god of destruction. The sea is vast, and across it, there are still lands that could provide supplies, could offer hope. Of course, doing so would require time, and time is the most precious commodity in moments like these. But nations far from the demonic statue's immediate threat, those still outside its reach, might take advantage of that final sliver of time to act. To build modern-day Noah's Arks. To carry a small part of humanity out to sea, drifting in search of a chance to survive. And, who knows, maybe in time, I, the author, will come up with or even dream of the next part of the story about those very people. Just like the legend of Noah's Ark that lived on after the storm.